Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our event tonight. It's great to see so many of you here. There's over 100 of us currently, and still some more joining, I can see. My name's Georgia. I'm going to be taking you through the event tonight. I am a nursing associate and I am a RCN representative for nursing support workers in the East Midlands. And I'm sure most of you are aware that the RCN is a UK-based membership organisation, but I can see that we've got some people from around the world tonight, and that's lovely to see. And we're very happy to have you here. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. If everyone could please mute themselves. I believe there's a couple of people that aren't on mute, just to avoid the background noise when our speakers are talking. And if you just keep your cameras off, it might make your Wi-Fi work a little bit better, so that you can see the slides that are going on. If you're having any problems and aren't able to see the slides that come on, would suggest leaving and maybe trying to join back again to see if that helps. There will be an opportunity after the talks for you guys to ask some questions, and we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. If you can pop them in the chat and we will read through them. Or if you're really keen to talk to our speakers, if you pop your hand up and we will unmute you so that you can do so. So like I said, I am a nursing support workers representative for the East Midlands, and tonight we are celebrating the history of nursing. And we are looking at, we're going to have two speakers that are going to talk to us tonight, both of which have got some great talks for you. So one of those is Stuart Wildman, and he is a research fellow at the University of Birmingham. He's an expert on poor law and workhouse nursing, and is a member of the RCN History of Nursing Forum. So some great information coming from him. And secondly, we'll be hearing from Rachel Kidd, and she is the curator of Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse, and she led on the Making the Rounds exhibition, supporting the volunteer research into nursing stories that underpinned it. Really pleasured and pleased to be able to introduce these two to you. I've had the pleasure of seeing their presentations, so I know that what they're sharing with you tonight is going to be very interesting for all of us, I'm sure. So if we're ready to start with Stuart, and he will be focusing on the history of workhouse nursing. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. I'm just going to give an overview of workhouse nursing from 1834 through to the 20th century. And I'm going to share my presentation, which seems to be at the end rather than the beginning. There we are. I'm going to start with this slide and this quote. Everyone conversant with workhouses knows the workhouse nurse. She is in most cases a drunken, foul-mouthed, used-up old hag, with neither feeling nor skill, and totally unfit for a task which makes large demands on the better qualities of woman's nature. The old type of hospital nurse was bad enough, but the workhouse nurse is the lowest of all. This quote from the Morning Post was a reaction to the decision in Rye, Sussex, to admit an elderly couple into the workhouse rather than supporting them in their own home. The year 1865 is very significant, as criticism erupted about poor law nursing following the death of two paupers from neglect in London workhouses. Timothy Daly died in the Holborn workhouse in December 1864, and Richard Gibson at St Giles in February 1865. These deaths provoked widespread revulsion and increased agitation from reformers such as Louisa Twining, founder of the Workhouse Visiting Society, Florence Nightingale, and other prominent citizens such as Charles Dickens. In the same year, the Lancet Medical Journal initiated an inquiry into medical care in the London workhouses, and the Poor Law Board directed its own inspectors to report on the state of workhouse care. These inquiries were then extended to investigate provincial workhouses. They found that much of the nursing was delivered by paupers, both men and women, who had no experience of attending the sick, were often illiterate, and featured in press accounts of scandals which involved neglect, cruelty, and violence. The bleak accounts of the deaths of these two men most certainly influenced the article in the Morning Post, but the subsequent inquiries and general uproar about poor facilities and the parlous standards of treatment and care had a lasting effect, not just in terms of public opinion, but also in the way the history of poor law nursing has been depicted. The care of the destitute was enshrined in the Elizabethan Poor Law Act of 1601. This established that the poor who were unable to provide for themselves were to be the responsibility of the parish, the lowest level of government, and financed by a property tax known as the poor rate. This system lasted for over 200 years, but became a cause of concern because of spiralling costs and hardening attitudes towards the poor. In response, the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act established a new poor law, with a central government department to oversee the system and over 600 poor law unions made up of groups of parishes in England and Wales. The central authority supervised unions through its inspectors and auditors. Each union had an elected board of guardians who managed the system and employed officers to conduct the day-to-day business. It was claimed that the independence of the poor would be promoted by restricting the amount of support for the unemployed, known as outdoor relief, by forcing all who claimed support to enter the workhouse. This was known as the workhouse test. Here, conditions were to be based on strict discipline and timetables dictating the daily routine, a monotonous diet, splitting up the family, and some form of hard labour for the able-bodied poor. The support for each pauper was to be set at a level lower than the income of the lowest paid labourer in the locality, and was known as the principle of less eligibility. This was intended to act as a deterrent for all but those in genuine need. There was little reference to medical care in the Act, other than empowering magistrates to order treatment in cases of emergency. It was expected that support of the sick would go on much the same as before. This was not a monolithic system, though, as widely believed today. There was widespread opposition to the poor law, particularly in the north of England. It was not implemented equally across the country, with local guardians holding some power in which they were able to some extent, resist the control of the central authority. Finally, outdoor relief was never banned. Let's look at nursing now. The employment of paid nurses was not stipulated in the 1834 Act. However, workhouses in cities like Birmingham, Bristol, Manchester, and London had a long tradition of employing nurses. In addition, nurses were employed in and outside of the workhouse before 1834, and some unions continued to employ nurses from the start of the new poor law. A general order issued in 1842 permitted able-bodied female inmates and girls above the age of 7 to be used as nurses. Paupers were not to be paid for this service, but were given extra rations. They were to be supervised by the workhouse matron, who was usually the wife of the master, who may or may not have had any knowledge of caring for the sick. The 1847 Consolidated Order first stipulated the duties of paid nurses, that is, to attend the inmates in the sick and lying-in wards, to administer all medicines and applications under the directions of the medical officer, to report any defect in the wards, and finally to keep a light burning at night. It was expected that nurses would be able to read and write. They were to be under the supervision of the master and matron. In 1865, the Poor Law Board advised unions to employ only paid nurses and to cease using pauper nurses, but little attention was taken of this. But finally, in 1897, an order was issued to cease using able-bodied paupers as nurses. This did not, however, stop paupers being used as attendants and cleaners in the sick wards. Also, where there were 3 nurses or more, a superintendent nurse was to be employed to organise the work and manage the nursing care, under the direction of the medical officer. Where there was a resident medical officer and a superintendent nurse, approved schools for probationers could be set up for training. Only those schools offering a 3-year training could prepare nurses to be future superintendents. Other unions that did not meet these requirements did train nurses, but they could only be used as assistants. Infirmaries independent from the workhouse were to be under the control of the resident medical officer and a superintendent nurse, not the master or matron of the workhouse. In 1902, a committee set up 2 types of training schools: minor, where nurses could be trained for 1 year or more and be referred to as a qualified nurse, and major, where those labelled trained nurses had a 3-year training, lectures, examinations, and certificates. Those who wanted to be a superintendent also had to have a midwifery qualification. There was an alteration in the roles of the matron and master and the superintendent nurse to clarify responsibilities and to prevent conflict. There was much criticism of this 2-tier system from reformers. In 1913, the 1847 and 1897 orders were rescinded. A superintendent nurse was to be appointed where there were 100 beds or more, and they took over the most of the matron's duties. Under 100 beds, a head nurse under the direct supervision of the master and matron, and the medical officer was appointed. Superintendent and head nurses needed a midwifery qualification, and anybody employed as a midwife in a workhouse had to be on the register. Inmates were forbidden to be used in any capacity in the sick, lunatic, and infant wards of workhouses or infirmaries. Again, there was criticism of the continual role of the master and matron in small unions. Let's go and look at nursing then from the mid-19th century onwards. This is a report in 1867 by Basil Kane in the northwest of England. In the largest workhouses may be found such hospital accommodation of all kinds as is rarely surpassed, whilst the nursing and attendance cannot be excelled. But in many unions, the accommodation for the sick is insufficient, the wards ill-constructed and too small, the ventilation imperfect, the nursing and attendance inadequate and unskillful. In some unions, few however in number, no provision for the sick exists beyond such as is available to the ordinary inmates of the workhouse, and no nursing or proper attendance can be said to prevail. Kane's report accurately reflects the state of patient care in the poor law sector in the mid-19th century. He and his colleagues were particularly critical of the capabilities of pauper nurses. Because illness and disability were significant causes of destitution, workhouses became very important in providing healthcare, as they dealt with almost 5 times as many sick people than their voluntary hospital counterparts. Workhouses had to admit all who were ill and destitute, which, as well as the acutely ill, included the physically disabled, the chronically ill, accident cases, venereal patients, those with infectious and skin diseases, women in childbirth, and those with mental health problems and learning disabilities, all of whom would not be admitted to most voluntary hospitals. Accommodating and treating paupers with such a range of problems would prove difficult for many poor law unions. It was only after 1870 that the local government boards started to press unions to provide better accommodation for the sick. In this respect, cities such as Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool, along with some London unions, led the way. For example, in 1869, the Chorlton Union in South Manchester opened a new hospital at Withington, based on the pavilion system favoured by Nightingale. However, the central authority had little power to enforce the building of new sick wards or infirmaries, as this was dependent upon approval by local guardians and ratepayers, and there was much opposition to spending money on paupers. And new buildings, therefore, came quite late in the century. Philanthropic efforts to reform nursing occurred as early as 1865, when the Nightingale Fund joined with William Rathbone, the founder of district nursing, to introduce trained nurses into the male sick wards at Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary. In London, the Nightingale Fund set up training at Hampstead and Marylebone. At the same time, there was pressure to reform nursing from the local government board, from organisations such as the Workhouse Infirmary Nursing Association, which after 1880 started to fund the training of nurses in London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham. Moreover, patient care was severely criticised in the 1890s by the British Medical Journal, which conducted inspections of 36 provincial workhouses and called for improvements to the facilities and to nursing, particularly at night, but also to stop the practice of using paupers as nurses. The problems were said to be worse in the smaller and rural workhouses. There were still unions without paid nurses or that struggled to recruit suitably qualified ones at the beginning of the 20th century. Nationally, there were said to be 60,000 sick people in general mixed workhouses, with many receiving inadequate care, and the workhouse regime acting as a deterrent to others applying for treatment. There were also many reports of problems within workhouses, from negligence and violence towards patients, sexual harassment and assaults on nurses, and clashes between nurses and masters and matrons. I'm just going to look very briefly at the northwest of England to show you the trends in the employment of nurses. We can use the decennial censuses, the 10-year censuses, to actually look at the numbers of nurses. So here, I've compared, this is the 53 poor law unions in the northwest of England from 1851 to 1911. As you can see, the numbers rise steeply after about 1881. And this is driven by two things. One is the continued pressure on guardians to employ nurses, and the other is the employment of probationers, in other words, trainees, particularly in the 1890s and into the 20th century. Secondly, I've used the census to actually look at the characteristics of the nursing workforce, and this is the mean age of paid nurses. And I've compared those 53 poor law unions to 10 voluntary hospitals in the northwest region from 1851 to 1911. The mean age of nurses reduces in both sectors, but at a quicker rate in the voluntary sector. But by the 20th century, the average age of the workforce in the two sectors is roughly equal, in the 20s. And then the next slide shows the change in marital status, and I've mapped here single nurses and the percentage of single nurses across the censuses. And the trend here is towards employing single women, almost 100% in the 20th century in both sectors. The voluntary hospitals introduced this change sooner than the poor law sector. So looking at age and marital status, we can deduce that the nursing workforce in both sectors in the period just before the outbreak of World War I was characterised by the young, single and female. The voluntary sector was probably about 10 to 20 years ahead of the poor law sector, as changes in nursing were introduced from the 1860s onwards in the voluntary sector, and it was only really in the 1880s and 1890s that guardians started to accept that they needed trained nurses in the poor law sector. Let's move into the 20th century then. In World War I, the more modern infirmaries were taken over by the military, and recruiting nurses to existing workhouses proved difficult. In the post-war period, The Nurses Registration Act and the General Nursing Council created the conditions to increase the training of nurses. For instance, in 1902, there were 8 poor law unions training nurses in the Northwest. By the early 1920s, this had increased to 22. Nurses who qualified in the poor law sector were able to move into various jobs following training. For instance, these 2 Birmingham-trained nurses became qualified district nurses in the 1920s. Official abolition of the poor law occurred in 1930, but actually it carried on to 1948 in other guises, and it was finally done away with the creation of the National Health Service. So in conclusion, by the 20th century, nurses had become the most numerous of employees in the poor law sector. In all but the smallest rural unions, nursing and patient care had improved significantly, and many of those who trained in the sector made a valuable contribution to healthcare in general. A study of England shows a change in the nursing workforce from the use of paupers and inexperienced paid nurses to a trained and disciplined workforce in the 20th century. However, it would be wrong to assume that there was a linear progression of improvement in nursing, as developments were uneven across the country and problems such as disputes with workhouse masters continued and remained unresolved in many places. Nor did the changes in the poor law service match those in the voluntary hospitals. The disparity between the quality of staffing and facilities in the 2 sectors would be an issue in 1948 with the creation of the National Health Service. Newspaper reports, a much used resource in my own work, tend to emphasize negative aspects by labeling of issues or events as scandals, and thereby create a negative mindset about nursing under the poor law. Those positive everyday acts of skill and kindness are rarely, if ever, reported. To see scandals as uniquely associated with workhouses misses the point, as problems such as violence, sexual harassment, negligence, and so on could be found within voluntary hospitals and still exist today within society and the modern health services. What is certain is that the description of the workhouse nurse, as depicted by the Morning Post in 1865, did not apply at the outbreak of the First World War and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. I'll just ask if anyone's got any questions. We will do a Q&A after Rachel has spoken, so hold on to those. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions for Stuart. Very informative, so thank you. And I'd like to introduce Rachel now, and she will be discussing nursing at Gressenhall Workhouse in Norfolk. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen, hopefully. Here we go. There we go. Thanks very much for having me today. It's great to be here. So yeah, this presentation is going to talk through a few of the stories of workhouse nurses that we found while researching our 2024 exhibition at Gressenhall Farm and Workhouse. That's making the rounds, stories of workhouse nurses told in textile. So this exhibition was a combination, or is a combination, between archival research and new contemporary artworks by a Norfolk-based artist, Connie Flynn, which took inspiration from that research. As a result of the exhibition and the hard work of our volunteers, we now have 70+ biographies of nurses who worked at Gressenhall, spanning approximately a 150-year period. So these biographies are an incredible resource about the life of the workhouse or life in the workhouse, but also reflect the wider story of working lives for women during the 1800s and nearly 1900s, and a reminder of how the poorest and most vulnerable people in Norfolk and the UK more generally were able to access medical care before the creation of the NHS. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the artworks in this one. We're going to focus on some of the nurses' stories, which hopefully illustrate kind of Stuart's points with some specific stories. But I just wanted to highlight one quote from Connie, who created the artworks for the exhibition. She says, "Cloth is a powerful material which can hold stories and memories. It can also reflect roles or identities and represent periods of time. The nurses have left few objects behind, so the textiles form a new layer of understanding and meaning." So for me, we had really few museum objects and only a handful of photographs that represented the nurses' stories. So for me, these artworks were a way for the audiences to connect kind of emotionally and visually with those stories, which we'll talk through now. So when we talk about Gressenhall Workhouse, we're actually referring to Mitford and Launditch Union Workhouse, which is situated near the village of Gressenhall. It opened in 1777 as a house of industry before the workhouse system, and converted to the county care home in 1948, shortly after the establishment of the national insurance system and, of course, the NHS. Although many workhouse inmates probably transitioned from the workhouse to care home at that point. So Stuart's already sort of described what workhouses were for, but I just wanted to add a really important thing to remember is about who the inmates were when we're thinking about nurses and caring. So the picture on the right is one of the few photographs we have of inmates at Gressenhall. It's a group of women, elderly women, children. Some of them are clearly are using wheelchairs, so have physical disabilities. So really a lot of the people who found themselves in workhouses did so because they required long-term continuous care, or had some sort of need that they could find help with at the workhouse. Many were elderly, disabled, had mental illnesses, learning disabilities, may have been single mothers or children. So nurses fulfilled a real variety of roles with these inmates. And of course, costs had to be kept low, so many of these workhouses were run with just a handful of staff and therefore a handful of nurses. So this is just that same timeline at Gressenhall with a few specific dates about nursing. And as reflected in Stuart's presentation, in this period, we have a real move towards the professionalisation of nursing. So starting with pauper nurses being used primarily, and it wasn't until 1880 that at Gressenhall we had our first qualified nurse, although of course we had nurses with experience before then. And continuously through this, we get paupers being used on the wards or working on the wards, either as assistants or cleaners, that sort of thing. And then into the 1930s, where we get more nurses and a much kind of stronger emphasis on care as well. So to move into some of our specific nurses, the first nurse I wanted to talk about is Mary Kittle. So she is actually the first named nurse that we have appearing in the records at Gressenhall, although we know there were other pauper nurses working there before her. So she worked at Gressenhall between 1837 and 1841. She grew up just a couple of miles from the workhouse at Gressenhall, in Gressenhall village, and she was born in 1806 to Judith Aylgood, who was a single mother. So early records from the House of Industry note the names of women and children who spun flax there to make sacks. And we've actually found Judith's name among the spinners there. So we know that Mary's mother herself was an inmate earlier, and therefore it's entirely possible that Mary was actually born at the workhouse. Mary married John Kittle, a widower, in 1835, and they had two children named Julia and Mary. Both John and Mary signed their marriage certificates with an X, indicating that they had limited levels of literacy. We're not exactly sure when Mary entered the workhouse, but she came in with her children, and it appears that she had been estranged was estranged from her husband at this time. Despite being an inmate, Mary received a modest salary of £7 per year for working as a nurse. And as far as we know, this was Mary's first employment. So she had limited experience, probably couldn't write, although her knowledge of caring for her own children would have been helpful. Despite these humble beginnings, Mary's employment at Gressenhall set her up for a career as a nurse. She worked at Gressenhall for about 4 years before moving on to West Norfolk and Lynn Hospital, where she continued to nurse for approximately another 20 years. Significantly, her service was seen as valid enough for Mary to be given a space in the local almshouse when she retired. Although this appears to be very positive, moving to King's Lynn, which was about 30 miles away, must have been a really difficult decision for Mary, as she was forced to leave her 2 children behind at the workhouse, paying a proportion of her salary towards their care. So this indicates the reality and the difficult situation that single mothers found themselves in at this time, and the difficulty of caring for children while working and building your own career to support them. Her replacement, Lydia Watson, had a remarkably similar story. She also left her children at the workhouse to go and work at the hospital in King's Lynn. Although this has a slightly happier ending, as we know that Lydia's children were later able to join her in Lynn when they were old enough to support themselves. Interestingly, her eldest son, Royal, became schoolmaster at Lynn Union Workhouse. And we know that Gressenhall employed pupil teachers to assist the schoolmaster. So perhaps like his mother, Royal also gained valuable experience at the workhouse and was able to get a career off the back of it. And this is just a page from that spinning book where we found Judith's name, Mary's mother. Following national guidance, we start to see nurses at Gressenhall being recruited externally from around the mid-1950s, as opposed to simply selecting them from the inmates who were already there. But of course, inmates continued to assist nurses and clean the wards long after this. One of these nurses was Sarah Mitchell, employed in 1863. She was one of Gressenhall's longest-serving nurses, working there for about 13 years until she retired at the age of 70. So this photograph of Sarah is probably the earliest one we have of a nurse who worked at Gressenhall. It was taken in a studio and she appears to be wearing her best dress, but at the same time, she's got the tools of the trade for being a nurse with her in the photograph. So she's holding a medicine bottle, she's got an apron on, sleeve covers, and a pair of scissors hanging from her waist. It was these like iconic nursing items that inspired Connie's artwork there: kidney dish, bandage, and scissors. So clearly Sarah is very proud to have developed this career. So this is an advert from a few years before Sarah was employed, but demonstrates what the requirements for the job were. You'll probably notice the lack of a need of previous experience of nursing. However, at least this time all candidates must be able to read and write handwriting, and testimonials were needed for their character. Like many nurses in the 1800s, Sarah came to nursing later in life at the age of 58. She was born in Hoe, a few miles from Gressenhall, in 1805, and her father, John Tuck, was parish clerk, meaning she probably had a relatively comfortable upbringing compared to people around her. She married John Mitchell in 1828 and had 4 children. Sadly, John died in 1843, and Sarah continued to manage the Angel pub, which she and John had managed together after he died. The 1851 census listed Sarah as a farmer looking after 46 acres of land, but as her children moved away, presumably managing this land became too much, and that's when Sarah took up the role as nurse at Gressenhall in 1863, earning a salary of £20 a year with board, washing and lodging included. In 1866, her son George joined her at the workhouse as a porter until he left to get married a few years later. So Sarah didn't have any formal nursing experience. However, her previous occupations clearly show she was a very competent and employable woman. Sarah coped on her own as a nurse for 5 years until 1868, when a second nurse, Rebecca Barker, was employed. In 1874, the midwife, who would come from the local town to attend to births at the workhouse, retired, so Sarah took on midwife duties as well. Many of the biographies highlight the hard work expected of nurses, and it was not uncommon to find nurses resigning or taking sick leave due to exhaustion. In 1868, just before Rebecca was employed, poor law inspectors recommended significant changes be made to the building and made it clear that Sarah was needing of help. So this is an extract from the minute book discussing this issue. It reads, it must be impressed on the guardians the necessity for engaging an additional paid nurse. The present nurse attends both male and female patients on opposite sides of the building, and we think she is overworked. She is, of course, assisted by such paupers as can be relied on, but the arrangement does not meet the requirements of as large and established as Mitford and Launditch Union House. And as someone who works there, I can assure you it's quite a long walk between different parts of the building. However, none of the additional nurses stayed as long as Sarah, and she was no doubt responsible for training all the new nurses as well as her own other responsibilities. For me, the next two nurses are a prime example of the professionalisation of nursing at Gressenhall, both at Gressenhall and nationally in the later 1800s, which Stuart has already discussed. As he mentioned, Louisa Twining founded the Workhouse Infirmary Nursing Association as a means of vetting nurses and encouraging formal training. So in these years, we see lots of junior nurses coming to Gressenhall with personal recommendations from the association, and also our guardians writing to the association to get permission or get their approval for promoting nurses to more senior positions. So Sarah Ellen Winter, and she's represented by the birthday book that she gave our other nurse, Mary Wallen, on the left there. She was employed at Gressenhall from 1883, and she was only the second nurse with a formal qualification to work at the workhouse after her predecessor, Ellen Murray, left. She was born in 1856 in Yorkshire and had a relatively comfortable childhood. However, was forced to become a housekeeper at the age of 20 after her parents passed away. In 1883, aged around 22, and with the recommendation of the Workhouse Infirmary Nursing Association, Sarah joined Gressenhall as an assistant nurse. In 1891, she was granted 3 months' leave to attend training at Liverpool, where she gained a diploma in obstetrics. And after Ellen Murray's resignation, she became head nurse and stayed for a total of 12 years. So as I said, we don't have any photos of Sarah Ellen, but this birthday book, so essentially where you write people's birthdays in against the different dates, was given to Mary Wallen by Sarah when she left Gressenhall. There's a message in the front which is really badly faded, but we can make out part of it that says, Mary Wallen, with good wishes, success forever, Nellie Winter, in remembrance of Gressenhall Infirmary, October 14th, 1895. So really indicating the nurses were very close and a support for each other as they worked together. I think it says a lot that Mary kept that book all these years. So Mary Wallen, on the right, known as Polly, was born in Birmingham in 1868. She started her career around the age of 18 as an assistant nurse in the children's ward of Coventry and Warwickshire Hospital. Mary is a clear example of something we saw a lot in the research, of nurses moving around between institutions to gain experience and promotions. She nursed at various convalescent homes, workhouses and hospitals before arriving at Gressenhall in 1895 with glowing recommendations. A year later, when Sarah Ellen left, she was promoted to head nurse at the age of 28. Mary stayed at Gressenhall for just over 2 years before continuing to build her career in different workhouses and hospitals across the country. This photograph was taken in 1905, around the time that Mary started to formalise her training by taking medical examinations. At the time, she was caring for Charles Dodge of Dodge Motor Company as a private nurse after he had suffered a car accident. Unfortunately, Mary's younger sister died in 1909, and Mary left nursing to take care of her niece, Elizabeth, despite previous employers writing to her asking if she wanted to come back. However, Mary's drive didn't stop, and together, aunt and niece ran a tobacconist's and a confectioner's in southwest London, before moving and opening another shop in Kent later. So increasingly, nursing became seen as a respectable profession that was typically entered into by younger and more middle-class women. However, despite successes like Mary and Sarah Ellen, Gressenhall's remote location made it difficult to attract qualified nurses. As you can imagine, living in a workhouse 3 miles from the nearest town probably not the most attractive of prospects. One solution came in the 1890s through a partnership with the nearby Fakenham Nurses Home, which trained young nurses and provided the local institutions with a stream of probationer nurses. This was generally successful. However, some probationer nurses were not up to the job. In 1891, for example, 20-year-old Kate Brewer was sent to work at Gressenhall, but the Guardians wrote to Miss Hammond, who ran the nurses' home, informing her that Nurse Brewer was not strong enough and not old enough, and requesting that she send a stronger and older nurse. So from then on, nurses had to be 21 before working at Gressenhall Workhouse. So for my final slide, we're moving into the 21st century. And this piece on the right by Connie was inspired by the striking nurse's headdress worn by junior nurse Eileen Olive Woods in 1932. And you can see her kind of in the middle of the three nurses in the photographs. She stands here next to nurse Ida Daisy Arnell, whose different style of headdress indicates her seniority. So I think Eileen represents probably the more typical nurse's story that we might imagine from the beginning of the 1900s, and especially sort of between the First and Second World Wars. So while many of the nurses I've talked about developed lifelong careers or not marrying to do so, Eileen was a nurse for only 18 months before she left at the age of 21 to marry warehouseman Thomas Dorman, although she did come back to volunteer at Gressenhall during the Second World War, as many patients were evacuated to the workhouse from the city hospital. So this shows the expectations still placed on women to prioritise family and married life over their own career. But luckily, we have some wonderful photographs from Eileen's short time at Gressenhall, including the one you saw at the beginning of this presentation. And her family donated the nurse's belt she's wearing in this photo, which we've now got on display. Our research ended in 1948, but I wanted to end with nurse Nora Mickleborough in the middle, who continued as a nurse, a nursery nurse and matron's assistant during Gressenhall's transition from a poor law institution to county care home, as well as through the turmoil of the Second World War. So Nora left an oral history about her time as a nurse, and what for me was striking was how fondly she spoke of it. She recanted wonderful Christmases celebrated there, dancing to local bands, broadcasting the music so even the incapacitated could enjoy it, and carol singing for the inmates. Despite the hard work and long hours, she described the workhouse as a community, a world on its own, and a place where people could come if they couldn't get help anywhere else. Thank you.